Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video, I'll be reviewing the latest season of Survivor US Survivor 42, which I know the general outlook on this season is mostly positive, and I do understand the reasons why, but I'll be honest, I'm a person that's a bit more mixed on this season, to where obviously the easy season to compare this to is Survivor 41, and I think from most people's perspective, this is a better season than 41, in every conceivable way, but I'm not fully on board with that. I mean, it is clear that this season did take some of the lessons learned from 41 and fixes a lot of the major downsides of that season in terms of its editing and its characterization. But I do feel like the general gameplay of this season felt a lot less interesting to me than 41's, where 41's unpredictability, both in terms of its gameplay and also in terms of where the edit was going, did make 41 a much more interesting ride to me. Unlike this season, where I felt like I had a good grasp on where 42 was going for most of the season, and also just from round to round, I felt like many of the vote-offs here were mostly basic. Where I know there's also the sentiment of this being such a great cast of players, and I also don't really agree with that. Where yeah, a lot of this cast is definitely above average in terms of their overall game ability, but I feel like that's modern Survivor, and I feel like for a modern Survivor cast, I do feel like this season was lacking truly great players, where I feel like there's probably one, maybe two you can argue, but I do feel like 41's cast was a much stronger cast gameplay wise. So again, to me, the season is a bit of a mixed bag. I mean, I don't have this overwhelmingly positive outlook on the season as it seems like a lot of the fan base does, but it is still a solid season of the show, and I still do have a lot to talk about here. So like my other reviews, we'll be running through the season from beginning to end. So let's start off with episode 1, which starts in a really meta way of Jeff talking to the camera and finally being open to the audience about filming 2 seasons back to back, which plays into the format of the season, which for the most part is exactly the same as Survivor 41 with some slight modifications. Now, I did hate most of these format changes for 41, and despite the minor changes that they made here, I still don't like a lot of these changes. But a massive pro for this season is the fact that this season doesn't need to waste the time that's spent in 41 to introduce these twists, which had such a major focus in the earlier episodes of 41, and now with the free time here, I feel like we got to know the cast way better than we did with the 41 cast, which I do think leads to this general perception that this is a stronger cast than that of 41's, when in reality, I do feel like it's more of just the editing of this season being stronger, while the editing of 41 didn't do justice to its cast. And again, the balance of this edit was very refreshing to see, especially coming off of Australian Survivor Blood vs. Water and even Survivor 41, which did have largely lopsided edits and some questionable editing choices at points. While with 42 here, just in the premiere, it did feel like we got a decent sense of pretty much everybody. So that is something I will applaud this season for, though I do think in terms of the gameplay of the season, it did feel like a bit of a step down from 41, particularly early on, with most of these rounds just being very predictable to the point where I felt like a good chunk of the rounds had no real intrigue coming into them. And it felt like a lot of these players didn't have the same perpetuity for blindsides, which we saw many of early on in 41. Largely due to the hands of Shannon Ricard. But moving forward, we do see the players riding in on boats, and as with most other seasons, along the way we get introduced to most of the major figures of the season. Jonathan instantly gets to talk about his physicality, which becomes a major storyline across this season, with his challenge performances getting a lot of focus, with it also end up playing into his overall strategy as well. And this wasn't unexpected to me to see him be this like Goliath in challenges, as just naturally he does look like a competition beast. But when we're comparing him to the rest of the field here, which on the offset seemed like one of the least physical casts in the history of the show, I think considering how much of an outlier Jonathan was here, really made his overt physical nature stand out. Drea gets personal content off the bat, talking about having to do hurdles half blind and talking about being a fighter, and Drea instantly has this edit that I constitute as a big player, someone that's probably has a long longevity in the game, but never someone that's actually going to end up winning the season. Omar gets a fantastic intro here, but one that does feel a bit overtly so to me, where he instantly talks about his job as an exotic vet, but also has a confessional talking about being looked at as a pigeon, and in reality he is this owl in the night. And this felt very reminiscent to the Erica storyline about her being a lamb turning into a lion. But I do think a major difference here is the fact that this line from Omar is never mentioned again, unlike Erica's, where she constantly brings it up across the season. But also Omar's edit here doesn't really reflect this general statement, where we did see this from Erica and even Tony, who had a similar style of storyline where we see them start off the season slow, but become more prominent towards the end game. Omar instead becomes a constant presence throughout the season, being portrayed as a strong player the entire time. That does kind of undermine that theme. Lydia gets a solid intro with her coming off as the epitome of Gen Z and has some fun confessionals along the way, which does make it very underwhelming that she gets a mostly quiet edit moving forward. But something I did watch out for here were the people that got these quicker confessionals during the intro, as last season, this is where we saw Erica's first confessional, and here the confessional that really stood out to me was Mike's, who ends up being an Edgic frontrunner in my eyes for a lot of the season, and this opening is a major reason for that, where you see him talk about how he has one shot and he's going to give it everything he's got. He later talks about diversifying his gameplay and that the most well-rounded player will win this game, which really felt like potential foreshadowing there and a potential theme for the entire season, particularly around Mike, as this notion with Mike himself does get further supported by Mike across this premiere. Also, as we arrive on the beach, we do get Marianne narrating the scene, and right away she has this really fun energy. Marianne is an incredible character, with her popping off on screen, though in a way that ended up being really over the top, which I do think led to some people knocking her out of winner contention due to her edit coming off a bit too wacky. But for someone like Marianne, I do think this is overall excusable, as that's literally who Marianne is. Again, it's not the editing that's trying to make her look over the top. She just literally is over the top. I don't think they would be able to hide that, nor would they want to. As why would they purposely make their show worse by hiding how good of a character Marianne is? So while Marianne wasn't a top contender for me early on, she definitely wasn't ruled out, as I do feel like a lot of this is just how the way Marianne has to be portrayed. But the opening scene here is pretty fun, with Jeff being a bit wacky here, with him having a fun back and forth with Marianne. He does do some weird poses for Mike. He gets to talk about the monster, which you can clearly tell is something production didn't have in mind at the time 41's filming. Also here, we do get this line from Jeff with him mentioning that he hopes Survivor gives you what you're looking for. And I do feel like this is a lot of insight into what Survivor is currently looking for in their players, where Survivor has transformed now into a show that's so much more about the journey and it wanting these players to develop over the course of the game. They really care about telling these stories of personal growth while out there, which is a direction I personally don't really care for, but is one that I feel pretty confident Jeff himself really likes, and I do suspect that this is going to be how the show is produced moving forward. But then we do get to the first reward challenge, which has legs where one person from each tribe goes off to do a section on their own, and one of these legs ends up doling out the first new advantage of the season, the amulet, which has 3 people in Lindsay, Drea, and Hai having to agree to work together and pretend they have a strenuous leg where they're all given mud and fake blood to cover themselves up with, which is ridiculous. It's a ridiculous scene where we see Hai smothering the blood all over his chest, which I don't get why they even used, unless like production explicitly told them, hey, you have to use the blood, but it seemed like no one really picked up on it. And I did like the editing of this scene where we do see the other players wondering what's going on and eventually being like shocked to how dirty they are. But as for the actual advantage of the amulet, I do find it mostly convoluted. I mean, I personally don't like that it can only be used if they all make the merge and if they're all in the same tribe together. I also don't like that if it is used with multiple people still there, that it quantifies as only one advantage, like 3 people quantifies as 1 extra vote, 2 quantifies as a vote steal. Like, I really don't like that you have to share this advantage. Like, I do feel like the practicality of having all these people agree to use this advantage in one specific way is very difficult to execute. But really, that sums up the entire point of the advantage, and the fact that it's not even really about the advantage, it's more so a bounty, where it incentivizes these players to vote each other out at the merge to get the ultimate prize, which is an idol, for being the last one remaining. And this adds an interesting dynamic to the game, while also adding in more established relationships coming into the merge, which again aren't able to form more naturally as there's no swaps on this season. So the inclusion of the amulet to the game here was something I like on certain aspects, though I feel like the use of the amulet itself does feel mostly convoluted. And really, as an advantage, I feel like needs some major tweaking if they were to bring it back, and really just in general, I could definitely go without it. But back to the opening challenge, we do end up seeing Daniel end up dislocating his shoulder, which did feel very reminiscent of Stephanie in Heroes vs. Villains, to which Daniel ends up referencing himself, which felt very meta and feels like a moment that definitely would not have aired back in the day. But the challenges end with a come from behind victory for Ika, which coming into this season felt like the train wreck tribe. I mean, they seemed like the physically weakest, but also the tribe that had a lot more conflicting personalities coming into it. And while the latter still ends up being true, I was surprised to see them not completely suck at challenges here. But similar to 41, the two losing tribes here do have to choose between Savvy or Sweat in order to get their supplies. And it was interesting to see both tribes go for Savvy this time, though Sweat was modified to only be one person, which definitely did greatly affect the results here. Though through this scene, we do get some solid content from both tribes. On Taku, we do see the start of Jonathan being this more self-aware physical player here, with him acknowledging that he isn't the puzzle guy and letting the others do the puzzle instead, which was fine enough content to keep him in winner contention moving forward, but wasn't an overtly strong premiere for him. But on Vati, we do get what, for me, more so solidified Mike as a top contender, with him narrating this entire sequence, but also getting to articulate him convincing his tribe to not do Sweat, as he feels like it would have put a target on his back. And it really plays into this well-rounded player theme, with him showing his strategic nature here, but also we do see him work at camp, during which he gets an intro talking about being a firefighter and how he had humble beginnings, and also how people think of him as this hard guy, but he's really a softie, and all this felt like really good content that possibly tinged on a bit too good for premiere, but definitely skyrocketed him into winner contention there. We do also get solid content for Jenny, with her leading the tribe through the puzzle, but also ends up mentioning her career as a designer. And while I did think of her as a contender after this episode, it did also remind me of the style of content you would see from someone like Amari Takahashi, where after the premiere, a lot of people incorrectly thought that she was going to be a potential winner. And really, Jenny's trajectory here does end up being a somewhat similar one. But strategically, Vati is the tribe that we get the most well-defined dynamics of early on here, with us finding out about the three duos, with Mike and Jenny being set up, though getting a lot less focus than the other two, which was definitely a knock against them here. We do see the Hai and Lydia connection, with Hai coming off instantly as this hyper strategic player across the premiere, with him talking about game theory and him talking about the dangers of the new twists, but in a way that lacked any personal content. It did make him come off similarly to Drea to me, as someone that I was expecting to be a big player moving forward, especially considering the assumed longevity from the Amulet storyline, but still not a potential winner. But the duo that does get set up as the swings here are Daniel and Chanel, who do get this weird setup, with us first seeing a lot of personal content around Daniel, with him talking about having leukemia as a child, and that was a great moment for him. That did make it seem like he could have been a potential contender moving forward, though his edit obviously takes a massive dive after the Jenny boot. But following this, Chanel is the one that actually gets to talk about these duos, but does so in a way that makes it seem like a marriage of convenience, as the other two pairs had already formed and Chanel and Daniel kind of get together because of that. But also, Chanel's content in this episode largely revolves around her talking about everyone else instead of herself, which made her come off as a very unlikely winner to me, despite her seeming to be in a very good in-game position. Taku gets the least amount of game content here, with Mariah and Lindsay getting two of the smaller edits of the premiere here, with Mariah's only content being her talking about wanting to find something while out there, which definitely felt like the start of a journey edit, while Lindsay really got nothing of substance here. And while moving forward, she does start to get some more narrational confessionals at Taku, she never really gets a storyline set up for her, that despite how much the Edge community propped her up as a potential under-the-radar winner, I never thought there was actually a chance of that happening. But the Taku Tribe's content does largely revolve around Jackson, who does get a massive segment revealing that he is trans, and Jackson's story here is really incredible, and one that was a nice story to see being told on reality TV, which has typically lacked trans representation. But mixing this in with Jackson's later medevac, it does lead to this scene feeling a bit exploitative, as it felt like they allowed him to be on the show just long enough for him to reveal his story, and once he did, they end up pulling him, which again, I don't think is actually what happened after all of the exit interviews and us knowing more about Jackson, like not telling production about his medications, but this did feel a bit icky the night the episode aired. But with that, let's just talk about Jackson here, who again had a great story, but outside that, we didn't really get to say much about him, particularly in terms of his game position, though to be fair, it didn't really matter considering he was taken out before a full round of the game, though considering Taku / Jonathan's dominance and challenges moving forward, I do wonder how Jackson would have done had they not pulled him from the game, as I do think it would have been likely that he would have made the merge if he was able to survive that vote against Mariah, and while I don't suspect he had much of a killer instinct to really make that much of a major impact after the merge, Jackson was probably in a decent spot at the time that he got taken out here to where who knows how far he really would have gone. But continuing on with the episode, we do also see the return of Shipwheel Island, which ends up being formatted similarly to last time, with Marianne, Drea, and Jenny going and having the same risk or protect dilemma that leads to Jenny saving her vote, while Marianne and Drea get extra votes out of this. But really, for me, the more memorable element of this portion of the episode was us getting this personal content for Marianne that really stuck to my mind, that kept Marianne as a potential winner moving forward, where she talks about her childhood and her self-esteem issues and being picked on, all leading up to her saying that she wants to show people that you can be weird too and you can win. And to me, this felt like such a blatant winner quote that I always looked back on through the ups and downs of Marianne's edit as something that pointed to her potentially winning by the end of it. But eventually we do get to the immunity challenge, which I suspect coming into the season was going to have two losers like in 41, but obviously they had to change it due to Jackson's medevac. But with that, Ika ends up losing the challenge, with Zach taking a lot of the brunt of the blame for losing on the puzzle, which really felt unwarranted and really felt like a self-fulfilling prophecy for him, as he ends up being the clear target here, and with him talking about being a super duper fan, it really felt like we were seeing the potential downsides of a player like Adam Klein, with them seeming to have a similar reputation early on here. But along the way on Ika, we do see a lot of Tori, who instantly comes off as a bit of a goofy villain, where despite her talking about being a therapist and her working on bonding with people, it always came off in a bit of a jokey way, where right away we do see her try to bring all the young people together and try to bond them over Harry Potter, which never seemed to actually be a solid group. Though it did seem like her and Zach had a bit of an alliance, with Zach telling her that she was in potential danger after she becomes a bit of a social pariah after the classic tale of her getting caught looking for an idol, and this does lead to her getting set up as the decoy boot. But along the way, we do also get good content for Swathi, where she just randomly gets an intro with her talking about her family and being in the National Guard, and this felt very strange to be included here, as she was largely unimportant to the overall events of the episode, and considering how she is later given a sliver of credit for the eventual boot, with the edit going out of their way to show her wanting Zach out, it did seem like Swathi was a top contender after this premiere as well, though the edit obviously doesn't end up supporting her moving forward. Also, we do see an alliance of Drea, Rox, and Romeo form, with that seeming like the most solid alliance on Ika, but really Ika ends up being a mess of a tribe, and Rox ends up getting a decent amount of content around him coming off as really domineering, and really Roxroy ends up feeling like a bit of a time capsule here, feeling like a player that you would see on old school Survivor, with him caring so much about camp life and sticking to his word and being really unable to play the game dynamically, all while rubbing people the wrong way. And while all this could have been very easy to portray in a very one-note manner, they did still take the time to show some personal content for Roxroy, with him talking about being a stay-at-home dad, and also he gets to show a bit of self-awareness in him recognizing how he comes off, which, while he was always an unlikely winner, it did leave him off the bottom of my power rankings at points. But Romeo also gets a sizable edit here, with many people considering him a top contender after this episode, but this was another situation where I personally never saw it, where despite him being present and having good personal content about being a pageant coach, mentioning that he can't win Miss Universe but he can win Survivor, which is a good winner quote, The problem is that the rest of the edit ends up undermining him. Where immediately after confessional about him thriving on the island, we see him completely fail at cutting bamboo. We have this established relationship with Zach, with him talking about all their commonalities and how Romeo wants to save him, only for him to completely fail at that and let Zach go. To which these were some pretty major red flags to me, and really I just did not consider him a potential winner moving forward. But again, going in the tribal, it felt pretty clear Zach was going home, to the point where even he knew he was going home, and he does play his shot in the dark, which did get a lot more play on this season, which felt like it being due to these players not being as skilled at executing blindsides here, but this does lead to Zach going out in a true unanimous vote, which was a bit humorous. But with that, let's talk about Zach, who I did find to be a pretty likable first boot here. I did feel like he had fun confessionals and had some notable moments along the way with his relationship with Tori. He had a fun moment at the mat where he answers Jeff's question only to admit that he doesn't even know what he's talking about. But really, Zach ends up being what you would expect out of this nerdy, super duper fan archetype, with him seeming like a high variance player, but one that I wouldn't be surprised if he was able to do well given another opportunity. Now for episode 2, which we do start off with seeing the Ika tribe, though Ika as a whole does get very minimal content here, and adding to them also literally not even being shown in the next episode, it did feel pretty clear to me that the winner wasn't coming from Ika, where with even Luvu from last season, they were still shown every episode, despite how jam-packed each episode was, and seemed to have major storylines being set up through those scenes, while at this point in the season, Ika really just felt like an afterthought. But we do also see the formation of a women's alliance here, which presumably puts Drea in the middle of the tribe, but we then hear from Swathi that Drea is a threat, and then we see her try to turn Tori on Drea, and to me this felt like a really bad sign for Swathi here, as to me Drea was someone that was so blatantly making the merge, due to the fact that the amulet storyline gets brought up here once again. So to me this was a pretty blatant red herring of them trying to make you think Drea was in danger, when in reality everything was going to flip and Swathi would have been the boot instead. Vati ends up getting a good amount of content here, despite not even going tribal, and it starts with a weird segment of Chanel catching a crab, which a lot of people thought was a strong moment for a potential under-the-radar winner edit, but really to me, it just felt like they were using this to transition to the high scene, where he ends up talking about being a vegan and struggling with the morality of eating meat there, and this very much felt like content you would see from a typical Journey edit, with him really not screaming out to me as a potential winner at this point, but this was the much needed personal content he needed after his premiere, which was lacking it. But then we get to the first finding of a Beware advantage, which functions similarly to 41 with different phrases, and overall I did feel like it played out in a less fun way than 41, though with Mike losing his vote here, it does end up having a larger impact on the results of the season. Well, this does lead to Mike finishing his trifecta of being a well-rounded player by talking about him losing his vote means that he now needs to focus on his relationships, to which we see him solidify his bond with Jenny and later Daniel by telling them about the idol. But really this episode does end up taking a bit of a negative turn for Mike here, with him losing the idol at one point, which is funny TV, but Daniel ends up following this up by talking about being mortified of his gameplay, which I do think you can rectify this a bit considering how much Daniel's edit turns in the very next episode. But this, and also Daniel talking about voting out Mike here, were probably the biggest knocks against Mike's pre-merge edit, that felt like similar issues to what Tiffany had in 41, who to me had a very strong pre-merge edit, but a pretty lackluster episode too. But Daniel's episode 2 here was pretty strong, with him getting the strategic credit for stopping Mike from saying his phrase, and trying to get him not have the idol activated, which through that and his relationship with Mike and Chanel, and also his personal content in episode 1, he did seem like a solid contender at this point, which makes it so humorous how quickly that plummets. But with that, I guess I should mention the wonkiness of the rules of the Beware advantage, where moving forward, Mike decides to not say his phrase, which contradicts the rules that were set in 41, where they were forced to say it at every challenge, which made good TV, but was terrible for those people's games. And it's even stated in the note on this season, so by Mike being able to not say it, I assume it was a call made by production to allow him to do so, but it is weird considering it seemed like the others were under the assumption they still had to say it. So to me, it does seem like the rulings here were a bit wonky. But then we get to Taku, where we do get a lot of Marianne content here that once again feels very over the top, with her like cutting bamboo as if she's like the antagonist in a horror film. But this does lead to Mariah and Lindsay getting content about talking about their annoyances with her, which again, this negative SPV did seem abnormal for a winner edit here, and really those are really the bigger knocks to me against Marianne's edit over her over-the-top nature. Now we do get a lot of content around Jonathan and Omar as well, with them talking about their religious backgrounds, but this ends up bleeding into their strategic relationship as well. And while it was great for their edit for their relationship to get this much of a highlight, I do also feel like this went against the theme that Mike mentioned in the previous episode, that the most well-rounded player is going to win, with Omar explicitly calling himself the brain and Jonathan the brawn, and they say that them together would be the perfect human, which again, feels like a good segment on paper, but it did come off as a red flag to me. Also weird that the Jonathan and Lindsay relationship was relegated to a secret scene, which to me was pretty much a death sentence for Lindsay's edit moving forward, but also a knock against Jonathan's as well. But then we do get to the immunity challenge that does start with a fun scene of Marianne being upset that Zach is gone, who she ends up calling her crush, which again, moments like this for Marianne are really unavoidable in the edit, as while it does make her come off as wacky, I just don't see production sacrificing moments like this just to prop up their potential winner. But here we do get a blindfold challenge, and without Jonathan's physical nature being able to truly help them here, Taku ends up losing, and the vote is pretty straightforward between Marianne and Mariah, with Mariah seeming to be the obvious boot here, with Mariah seeming to be the most expendable of the cast at this point, and also her getting her personal segment talking about her brother's death and talking about how being out on Survivor is worth more to her than $1 million, which felt like them essentially just wrapping up the storyline set up for her in episode 1 already here by episode 2. So again, I didn't really have many doubts along the way that she was getting booted, though we do get some interesting content from the other players talking about Marianne, with her clearly being set up as a less trustworthy figure over Mariah, which indicated to me that Marianne was getting set up to be the eventual downfall of Taku moving forward. But we do get the tribal where the Mariah boot is so clear that she ends up playing her shot in the dark, and we once again get another truly unanimous vote. And Mariah to me seems like someone that is going to be easily forgotten about in Survivor history the more and more we get away from this season, where she simply didn't have much of an impact here, which I do think is disappointing, as I did feel like there was some potential in her coming into the season. And she does get kind of unlucky that her number one ally in Jackson ends up getting medevaced, but I do suspect that she would have been the first boot from that tribe anyway, and I don't suspect that she had the killer instinct that would have been necessary to make a player like her and then being a top contender on this season of Survivor. So again, at the end of the day, don't know how much potential was really there. But now for episode 3, which easily ends up being the best of the pre-merge episodes here, with it just being an insane series of events, and so many insane events that Ika isn't even shown in this episode, which while I never had any faith that anyone on Ika was actually going to end up winning, I don't think this is the Edgic death knell that many people think it is, where they really had so much to show that would be relevant to this one specific round in this episode. We get this historic immunity challenge, we get Shipwheel Island, we get this really crazy vote and deliberation, we have Marianne finding the Beware advantage. Again, there was just so much going on in this episode that Ika not being shown makes sense even from an Edgic perspective, to where this one individual instance is not enough for me to rule out all of Ika, but really the rest of their edit throughout the pre-merge was. But again, most of the episode does revolve around Vati, with the only non-Vati camp scene is from Taku, which again has to be there because Marianne found the Beware advantage, and we do get this fun, overly dramatic reveal to her tribe that she got the extra vote as well, and really these scenes felt necessary for them to show on the show. The only other pre-challenge scene comes from Vati, which really sets up the train wreck that ends up happening afterwards, where Daniel's edit completely nosedives here, where everything he just mocked Mike for in the previous episode ends up happening to him here. He ends up losing Mike's idol after asking him to allow him to read the rules for the idol, and this was just such a surreal scene. I mean, at least in the last episode, Mike lost his own idol, and like that's weird, but here Daniel is losing Mike's idol. And this entire segment is so funny to me, considering you can clearly tell that Mike is just so pissed off the entire time and is thinking that like Daniel's pulling something on him. But also through this scene, we do see that Daniel's plan from the previous round of making Mike not say his phrase, which he got strategic credit for, is actually something that doesn't work here, as the idols become active at the merge anyway. So this plan would have actually backfired on him, as it actually makes sense to make the idols active, as in that way they are public idols and you know where they're coming from instead of secret idols. Which again, like, all this just completely undoes all the positive content Daniel was given in the previous episode. It was Daniel admitting that Mike was right. It does really prop Mike back up from his middling episode 2. But then we get to the historic challenge, which I had already predicted what was going to happen here before the episode, especially when we get so much talk about how strong the tide is to where you could see that the starting platform is moving along with it. And this is really where Jonathan's edit starts to get really ridiculous with how much they're propping him up as a challenge beast. Where in most team challenges moving forward, he ends up almost single-handedly winning it for his team. And this challenge in particular ends up being one of the most impressive individual performances in a team challenge I've probably ever seen. I mean, where we see the other tribes struggling to even just swim due to how bad the tide is, Jonathan is almost single-handedly doing this entire challenge for Taku. I mean, he carries the ladder by himself. He goes back into the water to help Omar and Marianne through the swim. He does the tossing at the end and wins the challenge for the tribe. And again, all of this is really insane. Again, from someone that doesn't care about the challenges in Survivor, I did find this to be pretty riveting TV here. Just see him dominate this challenge by himself. And found it really funny how over the top the edit was in propping him up as well. But then we get to a ridiculous montage of everyone struggling with the ladder and the tide, almost submerging them, to the point where Jeff ends up stopping the challenge and making them start back on shore, which, I mean, as a historic moment. But really, to me, the Jonathan stuff ends up being way more memorable to me here, though Vati ends up losing the challenge, and we do see the return of Shipwheel Island, which thankfully was missing in episode 2, and we do also lose the summit from episode 3 like it was in 41, as those two occurrences really did clog up a lot of screen time, which again, I do think is a product of them learning from their experience producing 41. But here, Omar and Chanel do end up going to Shipwheel, which humorously ends up crumbling Chanel's game, where we see Chanel talk about how she can't lose her vote. And even back at camp, we get constant talk from the rest of her tribe mates about how necessary Chanel's vote is, only for her to risk her vote here. And with them not communicating properly, and Omar obviously risking his vote as well, it does lead to both of them losing their votes, which I will say this was also not the greatest look for Omar either, with him being blatantly shown to have the wrong read on Chanel, though obviously at the same time Chanel comes off poorly here, completely contradicting herself. And this really ends up being the major catalyst for the upcoming crazy vote, as with Daniel and Chanel having leaned towards siding with Mike and Jenny, but now with both Chanel and Mike not having votes at the next tribal, it makes the upcoming vote a 2v2 instead of a 4v2. That is, if Chanel and Daniel remain loyal to Mike and Jenny, which I will say I don't get why they do. I mean, I assume it must have been due to either them having a really good relationship with Jenny or the fact that they were worried about burning the guy that will eventually have the idol, but I do feel like at this point, they really should have just cut their losses and sided with Mike and Hai, who 100% thought they were loyal to them. Also, the fact that they don't is also a major indictment to me on Hai and Lydia's ability in the game. They couldn't even keep Daniel and Chanel on their side when they had no real reason to be voting with the other side at this point. But once Daniel and Chanel reconvene and solidify that they're going for Lydia, Chanel ends up creating this plan to lie to Hai and Lydia about splitting the vote with a guy-girl split so that they can win out in a 2-to-1-to-1 vote, which would have been very impressive had they been able to execute here. But instantly we do see Hai notice that Chanel is frazzled, and Edit really tries to give Hai a lot of credit here, which I will say I don't think a lot of it is warranted, as Hai still had no clue what was going on here, and while he does end up switching his vote, which does lead to the 2v2 tie, he still had no clue that Mike or Chanel had lost their votes. So realistically, him switching his vote here shouldn't have mattered if the game had gone in the way that he was assuming it was going to be, as it would have just been a 4-to-2 vote, or 3-to-2 if he assumed that Chanel lost her vote. But again, his vote really did not matter unless he got into the very lucky situation that just so happened to happen considering Mike had lost his vote, something that he didn't even know happened. So again, the strategic credit here for me for Hai is largely unwarranted. No matter how many weird looks or glances we see from him at Tribal, that the edit tries to make it seem like he's kind of in the know. Because like even after the votes are revealed, even he is saying out loud, where are the votes? making it very clear how confused he really is. But this always did seem poised to be a really insane tribal where we're getting to the vote with 17 minutes left in the episode. But again, it does lead to a 2v2 tie, and Hai having no real incentive on flipping here, considering how confused he was at what was even going on to begin with. So again, if I were Daniel, I would have flipped back here. Though I guess like him going to a deadlock isn't necessarily the worst thing either, as flipping here can be a bad look perception-wise. But again, the possibility of Hai flipping was just so unlikely to me. And when we get to the deadlock itself, we do find out that because Mike and Chanel don't have votes, they can't vote as part of the consensus needed to stop the rock draw, but they can obviously talk during the deliberation and will also draw rocks if consensus is not made. And rule-wise, I did actually like how this was handled for the most part, though I don't love that Mike and Chanel had to expose that they didn't have their votes. And for Mike in particular, it does kind of end up blowing up his spot as it makes it clear to the others that he has some sort of advantage that he didn't tell some of the others about. But then we get to the main source of intrigue here in Daniel blowing up his and Chanel's game. Now, instantly, he just gives up on the negotiation by openly saying that he's not willing to go to rocks, which instantly gives up all the leverage he had against Hai. But in reality, I actually don't have that much of an issue with that, as I did find it dumb for Daniel to even consider going to rocks. And again, I don't get why Daniel and Chanel cared enough to even go this route to begin with. And also, even if they do go to rocks, it becomes a 3v1 to where Hai has good odds anyway. So I don't have an issue with him instantly folding here. Now, I do think the fact that he does it like right away is a bad look, similar in a way that it would have been to flip, where again, I do think that plays into part of why like Mike in particular was upset at him moving forward. But again, Hai has no reason to flip here. And again, people really credit Hai for how he handles this deliberation, but to me, he really just plays it pretty baseline here. I mean, Daniel just hands him all the leverage without Hai actually doing any work to actually get that, and really all Hai had to do was just not mess it up. But then we get to the really egregious gameplay of Daniel's, where he decides to throw Chanel under the bus as well, which obviously ends up burning his number one ally, but even beyond that, shows everyone else that he's willing to burn his number one ally, to where at this point, I had no doubt that Daniel was going to be the boot the next time they went to tribal, as he literally burns everyone on his tribe here. He obviously initially voted against Hai and Lydia, he just threw Chanel under the bus, and then he also burns Mike by really putting the blame of the Jenny boot onto his shoulders, and in turn costing Mike his closest ally. So Daniel completely blows up his game here in a way that felt pretty unrepairable, which is a shame considering his strong positioning before this. But this was a great scene to see Hai and Lydia reacting to them almost being blindsided, and seeing the reaction from Chanel of her being thrown under the bus. And it also completely flips the power structure of the tribe here, giving Hai and Lydia the power afterwards, again due to very little they actually did, but really due to all this craziness here, Jenny ends up going home in this round despite the fact that she probably played the best out of those at tribal here. And I mean, we can talk about Jenny, who I feel like is a player with a lot of potential in the game. And while she's not the flashiest player in the world, I think she does seem to understand risk and reward. And while you can argue she's a bit too passive, I do think she played almost as well as she could have been, considering she was booted at this point in the game, where, again, yeah, you can fault her for being the person that Hai and Lydia voted for, but one, I think general perception in terms of Mike's physical strength played a factor into that. And really just outside of that, she gets very unlucky here in that despite her and Mike being successful in getting Chanel and Daniel to vote with them in a way that would have caused Chanel and Daniel to burn the other side, where again, she would have been very well positioned coming out of this round, but because two of her allies lose their votes in something that's out of her control, it causes a tie that goes to a deadlock in a position where rock draw is completely against her alliance's best interest. And even in the case of like Mike losing his vote, he didn't know he was going to lose his vote when he opened the Beware advantage. It's like that's another luck-based circumstance. So really, again, like I just feel like Jenny gets super unlucky in how the game ends up playing out here. And despite her being as early of a boot as she is here, I do think she plays mostly optimally for most of the time that she's out there. Now let's jump into episode 4, which after an episode without any Ika, we do get a lot of Ika, with the other two tribes getting relatively brief segments, which the inclusion of a reward challenge really played into that, which again, Jonathan gets really propped up for his challenge performance across this episode, and ends up openly talking about Taku being a strong 4, which seemed like a very questionable thing to say at the time, as I do think it could have easily painted Taku as this like tight underdog group coming into the merge that should have been targeted, though that doesn't end up playing much of a factor. But this is where we do see Marianne and Omar being upset at Jonathan for doing so, which kind of starts this strained Jonathan-Marianne relationship that has become highlighted moving forward. But Jonathan finally gets his personal content here and does talk pretty articulately about his strategy of being a shield for other people, which did end up starting this like really large mixed tints on his edit here. Now, most of Vati's content ends up revolving around the ramifications of the previous round, with Daniel now getting the confrontations with Chanel and Mike over him backstabbing them, and also we do see the start of the Mike and Hai relationship that I was surprised to see how tight they end up getting by the time of the merge, where they really come together out of convenience here. But I did feel like this was a pro for both of their edits, where Hai obviously gets more strategic credit across this scene, while Mike instantly rebounds from losing Jenny into having another well-defined alliance, which continued his perceived winner edit here. But again, the rest of the episode is on Ika, with them losing the immunity challenge, and here we do see the continuation of the Swathi versus Drea storyline, with Swathi now fully wanting to flip the vote here by pulling in Tori and Rox. But here we do also see the start of this really awkward Tori and Roxroy relationship, with Tori telling Rox about Drea's extra vote in order to try to flip him over, only for Rox to end up not trusting her and relaying this information back to Drea, which initially further solidified Tori as the target here. That is until Tori ends up revealing to Romeo that it was Swathi that created this plan, which leads to Swathi's game blowing up here, with us even getting a montage of her promising everyone that they're her number one, and Romeo and Drea end up working with Tori to flip the vote on Swathi instead, and I'm mostly conflicted on whether or not this is the right move for Romeo and Drea, which at the end of the day, it doesn't end up mattering too much, but I do think Tori is someone that would have been more willing to flip on Ika immediately after a merge, but is also someone that I think is less likely to have as many options at the merge, where Swathi is someone that's already proven herself to be a competent all-around player that only got caught once Tori was in self-preservation mode, so she was a lot more dangerous down the road, with her showing more skill to open up more options for herself moving forward. And while in Survivor, I do typically go against this notion of the devil you know is better than the devil you don't, but in a situation like this, where Swathi seems like the much more dangerous all-around player, I do think I would lean towards getting rid of her and probably would have made the same call as them. And this does end up being another case where Swathi ends up picking up on the fact that she's probably going home, to the point where we see both Tori and Swathi fighting for their lives at Tribal, and Swathi ends up playing her shot in the dark, which I find humorous that Swathi knew she was going home, but somehow Roxroy didn't, and was blindsided by the result of this. But Swathi ends up going home, and I do think Swathi is another player that does have a lot of potential, with her seeming like a pretty well-rounded player, being good socially and physically, and having a somewhat strategic mind for the game. I do think she mismanaged Tori and Rox to where her plan backfires on her, and it leading to Drea finding out about her plan. But I do think if Swathi were to play again, get a bit more life experience, I do think she could do pretty well. But personally, I don't really expect it, as I consider Swathi probably one of the more boring characters on this season, as really outside of her downfall here, she really just didn't do much for the show. But now let's jump into episode 5, which is the penultimate episode before the merge, and most of the episode ends up feeling like set up towards that. On Taku, we do see more of the Marianne versus Jonathan storyline, with Jonathan being annoyed at how much she talks and how overdramatic she is, and this was overall a pretty bad look for Marianne, and one of the bigger true knocks against her edit in the pre-merge, where while I do think this was necessary to set up their rivalry, I do think the fact that we saw the scene almost entirely from Jonathan's perspective was pretty bad for her, though her edit obviously ends up really turning at the time of the merge. On Ika, we do see more of the Tori and Rox rivalry, with Tori talking about flipping at the merge, as she can't work with Rox, which I'm surprised it didn't really lead to anything, as they never really get the opportunity to end up voting against each other moving forward. But here we do also get the establishment scene of the Romeo and Drea relationship, which ends up being a really strange scene for Romeo to me, where he talks about liking to work with strong, independent women, and talk about trying to make Drea an even better player, which I was surprised to see this not really lead to much, as I get this was personal content for Romeo, with him talking about his mom being his role model, and this did feel like more of a thematic scene for his trajectory in the game, but to me it was one that even further dunked his winning chances. This entire scene came off to me as like him being set up to be the potential kingmaker, more so than a winner. But this scene does lead to the Ika Beware advantage being found by Drea, leading to the confessional from Drea with her saying she is survivor rich. And at this point, it did become clear to me that pretty much all of her storylines here were revolved around advantages, which obviously ends up with her being in a really good in-game position by the end of this episode, but one that made it feel even less likely to me of being a potential winner at it, with it seeming to set up her not being able to properly utilize her advantages down the road, with so much focus on how many she's currently holding. Well, this does lead to the immunity challenge, where the idols finally get activated, which wasn't nearly as fun of a scene as the one from 41 to me, but it does have interesting ramifications for Mike, where he did get some content earlier about not wanting to say the phrase to keep it a secret, which is dumb as his entire tribe already knows, and obviously it's going to go around at the time of the merge, but he does end up saying the phrase at the challenge, which did seem contradictory to that, though he does instantly get a confessional immediately afterwards to explain his decision in doing so, which leads to this being a bit of a mixed element of his edit to me, with him being kind of contradicted but also kind of rectified at the same time. But as for the decision to activate the idol, I do actually agree with his decision to do it here, as he ends up getting his vote back for this round, and while his idol is now public to pretty much everybody, that info again would have been spread around anyway, and more importantly, I do feel like this opens up potential inroads with the other idol holders, Marianne and Drea, who have an instant bond now due to them having the Beware advantage. And I also feel like if they were to eventually find out that he didn't say the phrase, that would also cause them to be annoyed at him for not doing so. So again, like, I do overall approve this move to say the phrase. And again, along the way, we also get more Jonathan single-handedly winning the challenge for his tribe, with Taku having this big come from behind victory with him dominating the slingshot portion of the challenge. But it does end with Vati going back to tribal, but before that we do get another visit to Shipwheel Island, which probably ends up being the most irrelevant visit to Shipwheel Island up to this point, with Lydia and Roxroy going, two people who have nothing in common, and neither of them end up risking their votes. So again, it felt like a major waste of time, especially considering Lydia is literally a next boot anyway, though it does lead to Lydia getting some solid content talking about body positivity, and we do get this really awkward scene between the two of them not giving the other anything to work with. But really, the Daniel boot to me was so obvious across this episode, with me not really having any doubt the entire way, especially when we have this opening scene of Daniel going fishing and the entire tribe bonding over mocking him during this scene. But the vote obviously comes down to Daniel or Chanel, and I will say I do think Vati ends up making the wrong choice here, where I understand that Daniel has literally burned everyone and is more of a consensus boot here, but I do think Chanel is the far more dangerous player, having more potential to flip at the merge, where obviously this doesn't end up backfiring on them anyway, but to me, Daniel seemed like someone that would have remained loyal to them at the merge, and I do think it would have been a better call to keep him around over Chanel, and that is further proven by the events of this tribal, where despite the Daniel boot still being obvious, we do end up seeing Chanel play really self-interestedly here and putting a vote on Mike in the case that Daniel plays his shot in the dark. And despite this backfiring on Chanel and burning her relationship with Mike moving forward, I do still stand by this being probably the correct call to make from Chanel's point of view, where, yeah, it ends up being completely ineffective because she didn't realize that the majority had already countered this by having Mike put his vote on Chanel, which would have split the vote anyway. But I do feel like for Chanel, this was the optimum move to make, especially considering normally you never know what's going to happen at the merge, especially with the split that we get here of a 4v4v4, though the merge itself ends up playing in a really abnormal way, to which it ends up screwing her over. But considering how close to the merge that they were, I do feel like this was a very calculated risk to make. But I will also say that I do love the moment where the Mike vote eventually gets read, where again it starts off 2 votes Chanel, 2 votes Daniel, and then the last vote is for Mike, which was a surprise to me. Again, there was no setup to it in the show, but also it was funny to see Mike, who knew where all the votes were playing out, just give this death stare to Chanel, with him knowing that the Mike vote was hers, as the votes wouldn't make sense any other way, and she still just acts oblivious to it, which is just a fun little moment there. But we do end up losing Daniel, who to me was the best character to be booted in the pre-merge here. I mean, he did obviously have some fun content throughout, through him losing Mike's idol and him completely flaming out during the Jenny boot, where again, this is one of the biggest downfalls I think I've seen across a single tribal, to where Daniel goes from being one of the best positioned people on the tribe to being the very clear next boot by the time they leave. But again, I do think he at least ends up being a really notable figure here, who had a pretty fun downfall, despite the fact that it was so apparent that it led to his eventual boot being a bit underwhelming. And now for episodes 6 and 7, which did air on the same night, which contains the entirety of the merge round, which obviously is a better format than last season, where we had to wait a week in between episodes, and with the cliffhanger being a really dumb one, as pretty much everyone's going to use the hourglass. And while the hourglass still sucks here, I do think not having to wait a week for a vote out made it a lot more tolerable. Before the merge, we do see on Vati that Mike is really indignant over Chanel voting for him, which felt really ridiculous considering he literally just did the same thing that she did to him, where he literally just split the vote onto Chanel's. So I do feel like, for me personally, this felt like a bad look for Mike, though I don't think edgically it harms him that much, considering that dichotomy isn't really mentioned on the show. Though it did lower my overall opinion of Mike as a player, as really the entire situation with Chanel was one that did make him look like a really emotional player here. We then go to Ika, which further shows this Rox versus Tori rivalry, with a fun scene of Tori trying to get information out of him about Shipwheel and him just not biting. And this seemed to set up a potential Tori downfall moving forward, but it really doesn't end up amounting to much. So it really just ends up being a red herring here. But then we get to the challenge, where coming into this, I was expecting the hourglass to return, but I was expecting it to return with radical changes after even the 41 cast bashed Jeff for the twist. And we hear from Jeff that they're changing things up here. First up, the most important change, they're bringing in Applebee's. Which, I mean, this was ridiculous. I mean, just as ridiculous as it was on IOI. Because of all the complaints, obviously, the food not being as good as Applebee's was definitely one of them. But then we move to the other two changes, which are a bit more integral, obviously. We do learn that the players will be told that the person going to exile will be making a game-changing decision, and also that someone from the winning team can swap out for that exiled player. And these are fine changes. I mean, it definitely makes the twist more fair in the sense that the players are given information that will allow them to sniff out the twist, to which we do see Drea do later in the episode. And really, it seemed like by the time the full twist was revealed here, most of the cast had already figured out what was going to happen, which is obviously a massive positive here. But I still don't like the hourglass twist to begin with. Now, the concept of half the tribe winning immunity is something I don't have as much of an issue with. I do think it leads to more interesting tribal where there's fewer options and certain consensus boots being off the board. So that's something I don't have that big of an issue with. My real issue is from the taking away of immunity, where it really just feels unnecessary. Especially when you're not giving the player that's making the decision immunity either way. It really just makes the choice really arbitrary, as you're rarely going to see someone not break the hourglass, as why would they when that puts them in danger? So again, I still find the choice itself to be really dumb. Now, during the challenge itself, we do get more of Jonathan dominating the physical portion, to the point where they literally play the Survivor theme as he's single-handedly pulling people up, which was really ridiculously humorous to me. And unsurprisingly, his team ends up winning, and they do get the choice between Lindsay and Roxroy on who to go to exile, and they do end up picking Rox, which, if anyone wasn't going to smash the hourglass, Rox is probably that person, really just showing that no one's ever going to use it. But after this, we do get to the Applebee's reward, which ends up being narrated by Lydia, which did give her a bit of a visibility spike here that did make me think of her as a potential boot from pretty early on. Now, Tori also gets a decent amount of focus here with her leaking Ika's secrets and clearly planning on flipping here. And really, her edit always felt to me as one that was either going to be an early merge boot or one that ends up being dragged to the end as a GOAT. But by the time we see how the dynamics play out, it did seem pretty clear that it was more so leaning towards the early merge boot side of things. Jonathan also gets a lot of positive content throughout this premiere, with him reestablishing his strategy, with others talking about using him as a shield, and Edit really propping up his social game that did make him a top contender for me after this episode, though that obviously doesn't end up lasting. But back at camp, we do see Drea and Mike instantly bond over the idol, which again shows the benefits of Mike activating his idol. But here we do also instantly see Drea throwing Tori under the bus and Mike throwing Chanel under the bus. And through this, and us seeing the reunion of the Amulet players and them agreeing to work together, it did seem pretty apparent that these players and their allies were going to become the new majority. And we essentially end up seeing all these power players in the game here create this super alliance, which did feel very big brothery. And this is something that's pretty unprecedented in this three tribe format, where typically you see two of these sides gang up on a third. But instead here, we get the top players from each of the three sides agree to align and take out the players at the bottom, which is probably strong gameplay for most involved, as a lot of them are the bigger threats on the board. But this does also lead to the game dynamics of the merge here being kind of underwhelming to me, with it just feeling like more of the same from the pre-merge. That being said, I did enjoy seeing a lot of these players finally being able to interact, leading to a lot of interesting segments here. For me, this is where Marianne's edit really starts to skyrocket, with her getting some strong content, talking about her options and her listening to plans. Though I will say a major issue that I did have with her edit at this point is that they don't really spend any time establishing relationships for Marianne, despite it being clear that she did have some, with the original Taku obviously, and then with Tori, who she seemed close to after the merge. But all she really gets in this round is a relationship with Lydia, a person that literally ends up going home here and doesn't even end up in the jury, and also ends up voting for her by the end of the episode, and she does vice versa. So I did find that kind of weird, though her not having established relationships does kind of play into the themes of her edit, with her being this outsider and her classifying herself as a weirdo, but still strange nonetheless. Now, Mike also gets some pretty strong content in this episode, though I did find the fact that he disappears after the immune challenge to be a bit of a red flag. But we do see the relationship between him and Jonathan, with them bonding over not wanting to be judged off of aesthetics. And really, Mike gets a decent amount of these sort of segments, showing him having good one-on-one bonds across this season. We also get some strong personal content for Romeo, with him talking about his place in the LGBT community and him bonding with Hai over that. And that was obviously a nice scene for them. Omar gets a lot of strong content here as well, with him getting personal content through his bond with Mike, and obviously him getting the strategic credit for the eventual boot here. But to me, Omar's edit started to feel kind of too perfect in my eyes for a winner's edit. To me, it very much felt like a red herring at this point, to where, yes, there are a lot of things that are positives on paper about his edit, but none of that really felt like it connected to the themes of the season as a whole. And through that, I kind of looked at him as like a Sophie Clark from Winners at War-esque figure at this point. But again, coming into the immunity challenge, this super alliance seems to me the majority, leaving out only Romeo, Tori, Marianne, and Chanel, with Chanel being the clear target for the group. Though we do get talk that Tori will be the target if the immunity ends up getting switched here. And again, it was weird to see like these players arguing why they should take out their own numbers, like Hai being the one that campaigned against Chanel and Drea trying to get Tori out, and again, all this felt like questionable gameplay. But then obviously we do have Rox on Exile, which did lead to some fun moments of him loving it out there and him building this pretty impressive shelter that Jeff himself was surprised by. He does get some strong personal content talking about him being partially blind and talking about taking this entire experience in, but none of this content felt as strong as Erica's content from 41 that fundamentally played into her themes across the season. This didn't play into it as much for Rox here. That did still make him seem like a pretty early merge boot in my eyes. But obviously all this leads up to the Hourglass twist, which is still dumb. Still frustrates me to hear Jeff talk about, oh, there's pros and cons to this choice, when there's no real true con here. But we get to the Immune Challenge, where again, it felt like most of the players saw it coming by this point, so we didn't really get that big reaction to the reveal of this twist. And who would have guessed it, Roxroy breaks the Hourglass. And really the only reaction we really see here is from Tori, who does come off as a bit delusional here, her claiming that she was trying to help Rox, and how dare he do this to her. And this is all a pretty bad look for Tori here, but through this and the Tori setup from earlier, it did make me feel pretty confident that she was going to end up winning immunity here, and she does, which at this point, I felt pretty confident that Lydia was going home, with Marianne being the only person not in the Super Alliance vulnerable, and her being clearly set up for longevity here. But right away, we do see Jonathan being set up as a potential target here, with Romeo getting a lot of the credit for this plan, and really seemed like most of the outsiders were thinking that this was what was actually going to happen. But this is another instance of Romeo being undermined in the edit, with him once again being shown to lead a plan that ends up failing. Now along the way, we'd also hear Marianne's name get mentioned, and this is where we do see Omar really kick it into gear, where he obviously doesn't want to lose either of his original Takus, and despite him not having a vote due to losing it on Ship Wheel here, he does end up leading the vote here using a convo with Lydia, where Lydia talks about the possibility of going with the numbers and voting out Jonathan as a way to portray her as someone that's already flipped against the Alliance. A move that very much reminded me of what Tony did to LJ in Survivor Cagayan. And really impressively, he's able to turn this entire Super Alliance against Lydia, while also looping Marianne into the vote as well to further solidify the Takus, and really just gives Omar so many options moving forward. Really making this an incredible move for Omar here, putting him in a power position. But also we do see Hai end up going along with this plan, which to me was pretty much the death sentence for his edit here, where obviously for his game, it is bad for him to let Lydia go. That was his number one ally, and puts him in a suboptimal position within the Super Alliance. But ethically, this is also really terrible for him, with him literally saying right before Tribal that this is where the good players fold and the great players prevail. And with him ending up folding here and letting Lydia go, that is essentially explicitly telling you that he is a good but not great player, which ends up completely undermining him here, and really the vote itself ends up being underwhelming to me, where obviously I felt the Lydia boot was pretty foreshown, though we do get a pretty crazy split of the vote here of Marianne, Jonathan, and Lindsay all getting votes as well, so at least that was kind of fun. But with that, let's talk about Lydia, who I was disappointed that we didn't see more of across this season. Where she had some fun confessionals in the premiere, but really just ends up being invisible until her last few episodes. But even then, doesn't really get that notable of content outside of her personal content on Ship Wheel. Now, part of that seems to be due to the fact that she seemed to be one of the least game-savvy players while out there, and one of the more passive players while out there. That, I think from a pure game perspective, she wasn't that important to really show over people like a Hai or a Mike. It's like, I get why they don't show her as often, but I do feel like she was a fun personality that I wish got highlighted a bit more in the edit. But with that, let's jump into episode 8, which for me ends up being a pretty predictable episode, where even coming into it, I was fully expecting Chanel to go home, considering all the foreshadowing from the previous episode, and this trend of the majority alliance after the merge holding together through at least 2 votes before fracturing. So I did find most of this episode pretty dull, and all that is further evidenced by the fact that the episode literally starts with Chanel being confused over the last vote and being worried about being on the outs, which is pretty much your prototypical boot episode edit here. Also through this, we do see Romeo getting similar sort of content with Drea, with him getting talked about as being paranoid since the merge, and supposedly that's why he wasn't put into the initial majority alliance. And really this felt like blatant foreshadowing towards him being the red herring for the episode, though I did find it interesting how all of Romeo's allies from the pre-merge essentially turn against him here, which was very jarring from a storytelling standpoint, and also just kind of weird from an in-game position as well, as, again, we get so much talk about how paranoid he is, when clearly he has a reason to be paranoid. He is rightfully recognizing his position on the tribe, recognizing he's outside of the majority, and we see that further evidence by people wanting him out later in the episode. So again, like, it is weird how much they're talking about how paranoid he is when it seems like he's mostly right on that paranoia. But here we also get more personal content from Marianne, with her getting emotional while talking about her being on the bottom and talking about this reminding her of elementary school. And later in the episode, we do hear from Marianne talking about using emotions as a weapon, and this is really where I felt like I was starting to completely turn on Marianne's edit, taking her a lot more seriously, especially if they're getting a lot of unimportant strategic credit here, and us getting these like positive checkup scenes with her throughout the early merge, and also with her winning seeming to fit the themes of the season. Mike also gets positive content here as well, where he gets another bonding scene with Omar, where Omar calls him a lovely human being, which was strong despite some middling content moving forward in the episode. Omar also gets some good game content here, where he has to detail all of his one-on-one relationships that he has with the outsiders. They did make it feel pretty clear that he was the best positioned person in the game, We then get to the reward where Jonathan once again leads his team to a win, but this is also where we get the rehiding of the advantage that Xander missed out on last time, and initially Marianne doesn't get picked to play, but Drea doesn't like PB&J and in turn swaps out for her and does end up finding this new advantage, which does lead to a fun segment where to get the advantage she has to dunk her arm in red paint. And this was a fun shake-up to the typical Beware advantage, though the advantage she ends up getting is the knowledge is power, which I still don't like. It's still an overpowered twist, especially on a season like this, where most of the advantages are public, and I hate how it forces players to tell the truth, but I'm sure production loves it considering it did obviously work out pretty well in 41. But this really makes Drea extremely blinged out here, now with the amulet, the extra bow, the idol, and the knowledge is power, which is really insane, but again, the edit never really supported her as a winner to me, so I never expected her to actually play these things correctly. But this does lead to Tori seeing the paint on Drea's arm, and in turn, restokes this Drea versus Tori rivalry right before the immunity challenge, which made it pretty obvious to me that Tori was winning immunity, which she does. But along the way, we do get the return of the rice negotiation, which I will say, Jeff had some really terrible negotiation skills here, letting the players start the bidding and catering to them by the end of it, which 100% production was always going to give them the rice here. But for Jeff to start with his offer of 9 and then instantly drop the 4 did feel ridiculous. But again, Marianne does get positive content throughout this, getting to explain why she's sitting out here, which again felt like them giving her credit in a position where they really didn't need to. But after the challenge, we do get some pretty generic post-challenge content, with the eventual boot being focused on first, with Chanel talking about being an easy target and talks about how she's going to lay back, and this is followed by the clear red herring edit for Romeo, where he gets portrayed as being paranoid despite him being on the bottom and him getting votes from the split. But then we see Omar and Hai both attempt to flip the vote here, with Hai getting most of the credit for the plan, which obviously the plan falls through, so this is another knock against his winner edit. But we see the flip actually get stopped by Mike, who does some strong work in getting what he wants here, but also does it in a way that makes taking out Chanel here look largely personal. And I do think it makes him come off as an emotional player here, not just for the viewer, but also for the players out there. Again, to make Chanel the first juror, again, a position that typically sets the tone for how the jury looks at the game, I do think for him to take out Chanel with her thinking that this is more of a personal move than a strategic one is something I do think harms Mike's perception moving forward. But with that, let's talk about Chanel, who to me is a really interesting player, where she's someone that obviously stems from the org community, and I think the way she approaches the game felt similar to how players would play orgs, where I think strategically she is one of the better out-of-the-box thinkers on this cast. Like, while risking her vote was dumb, I do like how she instantly had a 2-1-1 vote contingency. Her voting for Mike to counter Shot in the Dark. While it ends up burning her relationship with Mike, I do think it is a forward-thinking move that, again, could have saved herself. Again, these are very intricate thoughts on the game, but I do think she seemed to lack the social ability to actually pull these moves off without getting any backlash from them. Now, obviously, I do think Daniel blowing up their games didn't help either, but I do think there is potential for Chanel in the game, especially if she's someone that's able to hold control throughout the game. However, I do feel like she's someone that, like, once she faces adversity, I don't know if she has the social ability to get out of that. Now for episode 9, which ends up being a weirdly structured episode here, with this episode having the return of the split tribal twist, which obviously takes up a lot of time in its own right, but also with one of these tribals being a special tribal, in that it takes up a third of the episode in itself. It does lead to the rest of the episode feeling a bit rushed. Now we do start with a Romeo versus Hai segment, with Romeo having voted him out the previous night, and Hai seems really indignant over getting the vote there, which was a pretty bad look for him, and considering we also got talk from Hai about how Romeo needs to go, only for him to literally be the reason why Romeo doesn't go home in this round, it did feel like it was blatantly setting up his eventual downfall. We do also get the segment of Roxroy gathering the men and trying to create this all-guys alliance, which we instantly see both Omar and Hai turn away, with Hai even calling it a misogyny club, which instantly made me think that, okay, Rox is getting voted out here, but also we do see Mike and Jonathan being high on this idea. And this ends up being a bad episode for both of them here, them being lumped into this misogynistic alliance being the start of that. But then we get to the challenge where the tribe ends up being split, and we do get the return of Bermuda Triangles, where almost everyone drops right away, with the tie being really strong. But Hai and Jonathan end up winning immunity, with Jonathan also winning reward for his group once again. And with that, his grouping ends up going to Tribal second, and get to see the results of the first Tribal, which does greatly impact the events of this round. Now, the losing group's dynamics were kind of boring and so blatantly foreshown to me, where Rox was clearly going home here. But once again, Omar gets strategic credit in wanting to keep Romeo around as a number and ends up flipping Hai onto his side, which I really don't get why Hai goes along with this. While Rox is someone that he clearly doesn't have a relationship with, he's still blowing up the Super Alliance here, while also keeping in Romeo, someone who is directly coming for him, all for very little benefit. And the fact that Mike is also against this plan, and in turn this ends up harming his relationship with Mike, I mean, that's obviously really bad as well. But I do also feel like this is the start of Mike's downward trajectory in the edit, where this was just a really bad look for him, and how he constantly talks about how he is a man of his word, and how this move would make him look untrustworthy, only for him to go along with the Rox move anyway. But then the other group's dynamics were a lot more interesting to me, where coming into it, I was fully expecting a Tori boot, but I thought it would happen in a much more straightforward way, where instantly we do see that Taku has the numbers, with Tori and Drea being the easy targets here. But right away we do hear from Jonathan about how now is the time to make a move, and that move is to blindside Drea, which inherently is a strong move. But the way that Jonathan enacts it is all wrong here, where the first thing he does is go to Marianne and tells her to plan, but also ends up telling her that they're going to split the votes on her, which is really dumb, as obviously that would mean that she could potentially go home, but also you're telling someone they're the other plan, which makes Marianne think she's expendable here. But also, why do any of this when you have a very clear person to split on in Tori, who Drea personally wants out, and the fact that Jonathan doesn't pick up on that really shows his poor read on the game. But also along with this scene, we do get a confessional from Marianne, talking about Jonathan treating her like a little girl, and how she's going to allow it for now, which to me, again, felt like the necessary checkup scene for Marianne, giving her unnecessary strategic credit here, which did propel, one, her relationship with Jonathan, but also her overall game ability in the edit. But then we have Jonathan going to Drea and telling her this Marianne plan, but tells her that Marianne has to go so that they can flush her idol, which is obviously a major red flag for Drea, considering she openly has an idol as well. So again, really poor play from Jonathan all around here, and that leads up to his talk with Lindsay, where he comes off even worse, where Lindsay calls him out for his mistakes, the mistake of splitting the vote on Marianne, his poor read on the Tori and Drea relationship. And Lindsay gets confessionals blatantly talking about how he's not strategic and he's not listening. And really all this was a complete dunking on Jonathan after having what was a somewhat strong edit up until this point, where this mixed in with the events of the Tribal really dropped him all the way to the bottom of my power rankings. But as for the Tribal itself, again, it takes up a bulk of the episode. We do instantly see big reactions from seeing Rox on the jury, and Drea in particular being affected by it, saying that it's changed the way that she's viewing the game here, and you can see her processing this across the Tribal, leading to her eventually talking about this trend of black players going out back to back to back, and she mentions that she's going to play her idol here to stop that trend. And this leads to obviously a massive discussion here about race across the Tribal, with Marianne later blowing up the Drea blindside, saying that she can't vote for Drea now, knowing that it's going to be 3 black players in a row. And I really do sympathize with Marianne and Drea here. I mean, for them to see the jury comprising of 2 of the 4 black players of the season now knowing in their minds that another black player is going to join them, because again, both of them think that each other are going home, is a situation that I fully understand their point of view of not wanting it to be 3 of the 4 black players taken out one after the other immediately after jury starts. And I think the people mentioning that Drea and Marianne talking about this trend is invalid because Drea voted for Chanel and it was POCs that voted out Rox, like those people are just completely missing the point here. Again, it's not about the perceived why of these people being voted out. It's about the reality that they are, and that there is unconscious bias in people to vote with the people that they have similarities with. And while very few players are actively racist in the way that they approach the game, it's tough to deny that the inherent commonalities between people are things that are going to bond people together to make them less incentivized to vote each other out. And considering their point of view of the season, again, this being 42, where they had not seen 41. So in their eyes, this is the first season since the rise in the Black Lives Matter movement. It obviously makes sense that this is something that's top of mind for Drea and Marianne. And for them who are noticing this trend and can actively stop it through playing their idols, making it so a black person can't go home, why would they not stop that? And also you get people mentioning that, oh, they're using the race card to get through the game here, and that's also completely ridiculous. I mean, obviously, one, they use their idols here to counteract that argument, making it so it's them themselves are getting through this round, not their talk about race. And beyond that, Drea and Rox and Marianne voting out Chanel further shows that they aren't playing based on race. They're playing the way that the critics of them want them to play, but instead, these people are using it as a gotcha moment for them. When again, it is this continuous trend of what will now be 3 black players in a row that is getting them to change their minds here, not just one individual moment. Now, along the way, we do also get another really bad scene for Jonathan here, with him being upset that he thinks that they're looking at him as a racist, and then he calls Drea aggressive, which I get further junk Jonathan here, and really makes the golden boy edit for Jonathan across the season even more bizarre. And I will say, I don't think Jonathan is necessarily a terrible human being for the events of this tribal. I just really feel like he's an ignorant one. I think the way that he reacted to this conversation is the way that a good chunk of the audience would react to this situation. Where again, I think a lot of it just comes from a misunderstanding of what Marianne and Drea are talking about. Really just pointing out the unconscious bias that everybody has. And really, Jonathan here is just really taking all the spotlight off of Drea and Marianne and making it look like he is the victim here, which I do think just in general is not a good look for him. And really just from an Edgic standpoint, to me, this was really a death sentence for Jonathan, to where I really could not see him recovering to being a potential winner after this scene. Also along the way though, we do get a great monologue from Marianne where she tries to explain the situation, which obviously felt very similar to discussions that we saw in 41 about this similar topic, which considering neither season had seen the other, it really does show how authentic these struggles that the black players on this show are going through. But this all leads up to what is an awkward conclusion to the episode, where Jeff decides to stop the private vote and instead do everything out in the open. And I do get why he does it. I do think going through the formalities of the vote would make it feel like they're trivializing this important conversation that they just had, especially when it was blatant what was going to happen. But it was pretty surreal to see both Drea and Marianne play their idols and the entire tribe just agree to vote out Tori, leading to her playing the shot in the dark, which still doesn't go through. Obviously leading to the Tori boot I was expecting, but the route there was obviously very different than I was expecting. But with that, let's talk about the boots, starting with Roxroy, who again felt like a character you would see from old school Survivor. But despite that, he did get some complex personal content along the way that did make him stand out a bit, though from a gameplay perspective, he really just felt outclassed here, with him having a pretty shallow view of the game that, through that and his poor social game, I really can't imagine him winning on a modern season of the show, where I just don't feel like the modern jury would respect the type of game that he plays. And after that, we do have Tori, who gameplay-wise turned out to be exactly as I expected in the preseason, where I didn't really expect her to find her footing in the game. I thought she was going to be hyper-strategic in a way that would turn people off, but she did make it further than I expected, as I did see her as a pre-merge boot really for a lot of the season. And for her to get to 9th place here, in a position where, had she survived this round, she actually probably would have been in a decent spot in the game, with the majority at that point having to turn against each other, it does probably put her game in a better light than I was expecting it to be. And as a character, I do feel like Tori was a fun presence across this season, with her coming off as kind of like an evolution of the Angelina style of edit, with her being the strategic player, but the show highlighting some of her strategic play in more of a humorous light, and because that she does end up becoming a pretty notable character across this season. Now for episode 10, which ends up being another pretty dull post-merge episode to me, where most of the episode made it so blatant to me that Hive was going home that, again, I felt like there was no suspense by the end of the episode, where we do start off with Mike clearly being annoyed at Hive for making him vote out Rox, to where he eventually ends up talking to Omar, who really shines as a character in this episode with his manipulation of Mike here, which he does with a really fun energy. But then we do get the return of the other group, where I was surprised that we didn't get any fallout from the previous tribal, The edit kind of just shoves it under the rug, but the bearing of Jonathan isn't quite done yet, where we do cut to Lindsay going to Omar to rant to him about how bad Jonathan was playing in the previous round. Again, further throwing him under a bus, while also leading to a bit of a rise in Lindsay's edit, but still in a way that kind of undermined her, with her talking about how much she wants Jonathan to go, only for her to change her mind by the end of the episode, and also showing her failing to find the idol that she was right next to. And immediately afterwards, we do end up seeing Marianne find it as well, which ends up being a strong scene for her once again. Again, her openly saying that this is how she's going to get to the end. But I did find it strange how this ended up just being a normal idol without any special rules. That definitely did feel a bit strange in this new era of Survivor. But then we move on to the reward challenge, where Lindsay's visibility spike continues, with her ending up winning both the reward and immunity challenge here. And through this reward win, she ends up taking Omar and Mike with her to the sanctuary, which, similar to Survivor 41, they do get pizza and messages from home, which were cut out of the previous season. But I did find the videos from home here just kind of weird, where Lindsay's and Omar's did not get that much focus, while Mike seemed to get a lot more focus, but it's followed by Omar putting in some work in turning Mike against Hai by proactively lying here and pretending that Hai had called Mike his puppet, which flips Mike against Hai. Another example of Mike being an emotional player, and this was really the point where I was completely out on Mike's edit. Again, despite him having a strong edit for first half, this is where I kind of realized that I think Mike is probably more of this Ken McNichol figure or a Brad Culpepper figure. These people who had very strong edits in the first half of the season, but then the latter half of the season is dedicated to showing why they end up losing the game. And again, Mike really just eats this up here, and Omar really takes glee in tricking Mike to where it goes from Mike being upset looking like Hai's puppet, only for the edit to make it clear that he is now Omar's puppet. Again, making it seem to me that he was going to be a losing finalist that lost all the respect of the jury due to his emotional gameplay. But here we do also get Lindsay revealing the amulet to Omar and Mike, which leads to her agreeing to go along with the Hai vote in order to increase the amulet's power, which is probably the optimal move for her here, especially with Drea being on board as well, but does go against the bevy of content she had already gotten about how much she needs to disassociate herself from Jonathan. Now, along the way, we do get a flashback segment for Hai, where he talks about his childhood, which was obviously nice content for him, but also felt jarring considering the rest of the episode is showcasing his downfall, with Mike getting constant confessionals about how King Hai is going to be dethroned, and we do get this scene of Mike promising Hai that he is safe, which again felt like blatant foreshadowing to Hai being upset at Mike on the jury. We do also get this Dodo segment for Hai, where he tells Jonathan that he has an idol and will play it on him, only for us to cut to Jonathan telling Omar about it and joking around about it. And really coming into the vote, really everyone just seemed to be on board with the Hai vote, with the only person voting with him being Romeo. But it was kind of ironic to see the only person voting with him is the person he had a very clearly set up rivalry with in the previous episode. And despite the red herring of Omar thinking about taking out Jonathan here, which really made no sense for him, this ended up being such a straightforward round to me that ended up disappointing me considering how important the final 8 round should be in modern Survivor. But with that, let's talk about Hai, who I am mostly conflicted on as a player. I mean, where he does give off this aesthetic of being this really savvy, strategic player, and his edit is one that also feels like that, with him coming off really game body across the season. But I don't feel like we got to see much of that being enacted here, where again, I feel like he got very lucky with the events of the Jenny round. And while he was in the initial majority after merge, I think he was making all the wrong decisions for his game at that point, where it felt clear to me that he was on the bottom of that majority alliance. He was voting out people that he could have had relationships with in Lydia and Chanel. So I do feel like he's someone that was actively sabotaging his game across the merge. Now, he is a player that seemed to have respect out there, to where I think he would probably win, or at least have a good chance of it if he got to the end. But realistically, I didn't see anything from him on this season that would make me have faith on him playing the game well to get himself to the end. And again, as a character to me, again, he came off very game body to me, to where outside of these moments where he got personal content, I really don't feel like he added that much to the show to me, where I feel like his best character moment was probably his actual vote out, where outside of that to me, he came off as kind of bland. And because that, as a whole, I was pretty underwhelmed with Hai's run on this season. Now for episode 11, which did feel like a bit of a resurgence for this season, after having every episode since the merge not really do it for me. Now right away we do see some scenes that to me did really exemplify the themes of this season that really backed up my suspicion that Marianne was being set up as the winner here, with us getting this scene with Romeo where he talks about how all the big threats are going to go out and that the underdogs are going to take over this game, and through this and a later scene with Marianne talking about how people are not realizing what a big threat she is at the end and declaring that her and Romeo are in the power position, it did really make me feel like this underdog arc for Marianne was coming to fruition. And we do then cut to the majority alliance that seems to re-solidify with Mike leading the charge and getting them back together, during which he completely dunks on Romeo, and the edit seems to support this by showing him eating rice for himself at camp, which further doomed his winning chances. But then we get the reveal that Mike was lying to that group the entire time, where we see him talk to Omar about his real plan, in that being to target Drea. And while this is propped up as the correct move, the edit does once again use this as an opportunity to show Omar dunking on Mike, talking about how he's becoming the next high and how he's becoming the player he hates. And to add that with the start of the episode where Mike takes credit for the high vote, which obviously the edit itself made it clear that he was being tricked into doing so, it further did foreshadow his eventual downfall here. Now along the way, we do once again get more negative content for Jonathan, showing the players calling him hangry and him getting into a tiff with Drea, leading to him being really indignant over how no one's thanking him for being the provider, which again was not a great look for him. And we do see Lindsay once again wanting to target Jonathan and getting the women plus Romeo together to do so. But with this scene coming immediately before the immunity challenge, I did feel pretty confident that either Jonathan was going to win immunity or that he was going to end up being safe from the do or die. Which, by the way, we do get the return of do or die, which I still hate. Though really it plays even less of a factor on this season than it did in 41, but it's still this terrible twist that, considering all the intrigue that comes up later in the episode, to think that all that could have been for nothing because of the do or die really exemplifies what's terrible about this twist to begin with. Now, as much as I do hate the do or die, I actually do think thematically, Lindsay going home from the do or die would have actually been a satisfying downfall for her edit here. Where again, like her edit is so revolved around Jonathan, and for her to go home due to her obsession with getting Jonathan out would have been a really fun storyline. Though obviously it also would have been sad to see a player as well positioned as her get screwed over by a dumb twist like this, even though yes, I know it's a terrible move for her to play to begin with. But again, I still feel like a twist as dumb like this shouldn't even exist to begin with. But along the way, Lindsay does finally get personal content with her talking about how competitive she is and her playing football when she was younger. But again, it really just did not feel like significant content for her to end up winning here, with the major theme around her edit is still revolved around Jonathan. But then we do get to see the Drea plan come into action, where once again, everyone but Romeo seems to be on board, to the point where we get a montage from every player talking about why it's important to take Drea out here, with her being talked about as this big jury threat, and Lindsay in particular would be greatly booned by it by essentially handing her an idol to use in the final 6, guaranteeing her final 5. So she's obviously incentivized to go that way. But then we do get to where the episode picks up for me, where Drea starts to notice a weird vibe, and through that decides that she's going to use the knowledge's power against Mike. But in what ends up being a game-ending move for her, she does end up telling Omar about it. Which again, the power of the knowledge's power is the fact that these other advantages are public, but yours is private. And for her to leak this allowed Omar to counter it, where we do see him and Lindsay create this plan to tell Mike about the advantage in order to steal the idol from Mike, which on paper is an insane move, though doing this and then keeping Mike in the game felt like it really just undoing the brilliance of this move. As Mike is obviously going to want his idol back the next round, while if Mike is gone, Omar should be guaranteed final 4, as he is keeping in a big threat in Drea that would still need to be taken out at 6 and doesn't have the appropriate advantages to really do much at that point still, and then Omar would have an idol to use at 5. So I do think stealing the idol was a correct move on paper, but one that Omar didn't take far enough to solidify his position moving forward, but I do think it would have been more optimal to keep around Drea over Mike here. But then we do get to Tribal, where obviously we have Do or Die, and humorously, despite all of the talk about the Monty Hall problem, Lindsay, like Deshaun from last season, decides not to switch, but still ends up being correct anyway, which thankfully makes it unsuccessful 2 times in a row, and hopefully we just never see it again. But then we get a lot of fun from Drea playing her knowledge's power on Mike, only for us to get the flashback showing Omar, telling him about it, and handing Omar his idol, nullifying the knowledge's power, which at this point we do see Drea go out in a way that, again, I expected. To see her go out having played all of her advantages in effectively, with her also playing her extra vote here. But what I don't get is, why didn't she play the Shot in the Dark? Now, she has said in exit interviews that she didn't remember Shot in the Dark was a thing. But I do feel like that is a massive indictment against her game, as, again, once Mike doesn't have his idol, she 100% knows that Omar is against her, as Omar's the only person she told, which means she's pretty much screwed. I mean, she's 100% going home here. But when she does, we do get a really fun exit from Drea, with her showing more personality here than she showed all season. Or for most of the season, she had been this like cold, super serious figure. But here she's like joking around with Mike over using the extra vote on him. She goes player by player and leaking a lot of secrets. Interestingly, she does tell Mike that he would win the game if he gets to the end, which I believe she's confirmed that was to just put a target on his back. But then she has like a fun moment with Jeff, with her like yelling no as he prepares to snuff his torch. And we end the episode really bizarrely with like Jeff really propping up this season, which I feel like we don't typically see him do it that openly any point before like final tribal. So I felt that was weird, but whatever. Let's talk about Drea, who, again, I wasn't expecting to win the entire time, with most of her storyline, again, revolving around these advantages, and she does go out in a similar way to how I predicted it. And like Hai, I do think she was staying true to a majority alliance that didn't really benefit her. I did feel like the Taku grouping always felt like the core here, and with her also being looked at as a massive threat as well, she really wasn't long for the game at this point. Also, I do feel like she trusted Omar too much, which obviously leads to them countering the knowledge's power. But again, she was a big player here, but someone I didn't find entertaining per se until really her actual boot, where again she shows a really fun personality that I would actually like to see play again, because I just didn't feel like we saw enough of it here. And she obviously has these great moments at the split tribal and really ends up being a pretty complex figure, but one that I wish we saw more of the lighter side of her throughout more of the season. Now for episode 12, which very much felt like a coronation episode for Marianne here, with her really solidifying her winning chances, though with that comes some pros and cons to me. Pros in the sense that we are getting this satisfying narrative and seeing Marianne come out as this big player, but cons in the sense that I felt like it was pretty obvious that Omar was going home from really early on, with the start of the episode already throwing Omar under the bus, with him coming off as what he would later claim to be survivor confident. But also we see that, like, despite Omar giving back his idol to Mike and claiming to be Mike's savior, Mike is instantly plotting against Omar, telling Marianne that they should work together to get him out, during which Mike himself comes off as extremely confident as well, talking about how he's going to win against anybody, and that he needs to take Omar out as someone that would cut him first. Which, again, like, while this scene does dunk on Omar, I do feel like it does once again dunk on Mike, as I cannot remember a point where a player has openly said that they are going to win against anybody, and they actually end up doing so. Where usually that type of content is reserved for someone talking about another player, not talking about themselves. Now, obviously, I know there's this debate on whether or not Omar should have even given the idol back, as him keeping it would have obviously fully burned his relationship with Mike, but does guarantee him to be in the final 5. So I can get the debate, and to be honest, like, from the previews, like, knowing that Omar was going to be targeted by Mike, I was actually expecting him to keep it, and that be the reason why he turns. But really, I just don't think that was ever the optimal move to be making at this point, especially because, like, something we've learned from postseason press is the fact that Omar had an idol nullifier, which is really hilarious to me that they didn't even bother to show this on the show. And, like, I get why they didn't. I mean, they probably thought that it didn't really play much of a factor. However, from what it sounds like, the idol nullifier and the knowledge of it definitely did play a factor into Jonathan flipping against Omar, which, again, the fact that the Jonathan-Omar relationship doesn't really have a natural break-off point here did feel a bit weird to me. Again, we got so much focus around it in episode 2, and for them to not even bother to really highlight the breakup of it here does feel weird to me as well. And a lot of that really comes down from the fact that Marianne gets so much of the credit in the episode for the eventual Omar boot, where even before she fully takes control of this vote, we do hear a lot from Marianne's perspective, talking about the rationale for needing Omar out. But beyond this, we once again get more of this Lindsay versus Jonathan storyline, where they both plot to go against each other, and Jonathan declares the Taku 4 dead, and we do get this awkward scene after the reward challenge where Jonathan and Lindsay are the only two not picked, and they're both trying to reaffirm each other when they both know that they're clearly coming after each other, so that was kind of a fun scene. But something I did find interesting here is that despite all the negative Jonathan content that we got from Lindsay in recent episodes, it does feel like he does actually trick her into thinking he is on board with taking out Mike here. And really, Jonathan had a decent penultimate episode here, considering how negative his content had been in recent episodes. But again, at this point, his edit was dead anyway. But finally, coming into the immunity challenge, we do get the same talk from Lindsay of not wanting Jonathan to win. But this is where we also see that Mike finds out about the amulet only being able to be played this round, meaning that his side needs to make sure that Lindsay doesn't win immunity, as she could obviously hand the idol to Omar, which would obviously be a bad scenario for them, but it did also actually make me more confident that she was going to win immunity here, as that's actually not even the worst case scenario. The true worst case scenario is Omar winning immunity, as that way Lindsay's always going to play it on herself. Well, at least there's the chance that she doesn't play it on Omar, which, spoiler, she doesn't. So again, the fact that they were focusing so much on Lindsay winning immunity made it pretty clear that she was going to, and she obviously does. But through that, we do instantly see Lindsay talk about not wanting to play the idol, as she doesn't want to put it back into circulation, which that rationale is just really dumb. Now, I know that another factor here was that they didn't want Lindsay and Omar to be instantly paired up coming to Final 5 and be outnumbered, which, was going to happen anyway. But again, the comment about circulation really makes no sense here, where, first off, this is even a real idol that was found in the game. This is an idol that production always planned on being in the game, that has its own special mechanism, that makes it unlikely that another idol will be hidden because this one is played, especially when they already know that there's another idol in play from Mike's Beware Vantage. Plus, also, they should be aware that there is probably another idol in play anyway, because 2 of the Beware idols have been played. So again, that already makes this entire talk about circulation very unlikely, but the biggest reason why this makes no sense is because the amulet idol is out of the game at Final 6 anyway. So whether or not Lindsay plays the idol here, it's not a valid idol beyond this anyway. Meaning, if they had planned on adding a new idol after the amulet idol was played, they were going to do it anyway because it's not valid at Final 5. So again, I feel like her not playing the idol on Omar was a bad call here, obviously lessening her position moving forward, but also she ends up just wasting this opportunity to make a big move in front of the jury, which again, I think is also just a bad call. But again, moving forward, it really is a coronation for Marianne, where right away, Mike and Jonathan give away all the credit they could have had from this move by backing out of it due to Lindsay potentially playing the idol on Omar, and they end up playing scared here and putting their votes on Romeo as the easy boot. But then we get Marianne deciding to pull off what is really a game-winning move here in executing this Omar plan in a way that she gets all the credit for doing so. With Mike and Jonathan still splitting the votes on Romeo, Marianne is able to get Romeo on board and use her extra vote as well to make this a 3-2-2 boot, where it really makes it look like her extra vote was the determining factor in her winning out on the vote here, even though really Omar was probably going home anyway, even without the extra vote. As I just feel like it's so unlikely that Mike would have still voted up for Romeo on the revote when Omar was up for contention there. But through this, we do get some great confessionals from Marianne along the way, talking about how she felt like a sacrificial lamb, but she needs to show people that she's a true contender and not a goat to be herded. And through her and Romeo working together, did also feel like a payoff to them getting this underdog content in the previous episode, also playing into the themes that you need to take risks to win the game, which was mentioned earlier in the season, and also just feeling like a great culmination to Marianne's storylines, where they're taking control of the game, despite being looked at as on the outs for a lot of it. And we do have this great moment where Omar knows he's going home, and he looks to Marianne and asks if she did it, and she says she did, which, again, was a moment that was a great look for the jury, obviously radically changing the jury's outlook on how she's playing the game, making it look like this is entirely her move, and really making it look like Marianne's the one running this endgame. So again, for me, really impressive gameplay for Marianne all around. But with that, let's talk about Omar, who obviously displayed a lot of strong gameplay across this season, being well insulated for a lot of the game, though I do think he makes some poor decisions in his last few rounds, where while he is taking out these players that could potentially beat him in the end in Hai and Drea, it's also getting rid of these people who intended on taking him to the end. But despite those things, I was definitely impressed with his gameplay across the season, the way that he had so many options throughout most of the merge period of the game, to where I think he is debatably the season's best player still, and beyond that, I do think he is also one of the better characters of the season, where he just seemed to be having fun while out there and playing this like villainous figure in his confessionals, and through that, Omar was definitely a highlight of this season. And now for the finale, which obviously ends up being formatted similarly to 41's, where we see them arrive at a new beach for the last few days for some reason. But here we do see the ramifications of the Omar blindside, with us seeing a tiff between Jonathan and Lindsay, where the edit does end up siding with Lindsay here, and her once again getting to talk about how much she hates Jonathan. Though I do feel like Lindsay herself comes off really indignant during this scene, getting upset at Jonathan for not looping her in on the vote when she wanted him out and she voted for him and even had an idol to potentially even take him out. So while I do feel like Jonathan just saying "you voted for me" over and over again wasn't the greatest response to this, I did also find it ridiculous that Lindsay seemed genuinely upset at Jonathan in this situation. But really, Lindsay felt like the pretty clear target for me here, where she seemed to be primed to be the Final 5 boot, not only because of her worsened game position, but also due to the edit, really setting it up in a way that it made her feel similar to other endgamers that didn't quite make it to the end, despite being propped up as a big threat across the show and seeming like a likely winner had she gotten to the end. So I was expecting her to go here, but we do get the return of the Final 5 advantage that we did see last season, where they have to solve a riddle first, and this was a fun sequence where Lindsay gets it right away and ends up being the only one to solve it here, and through that gets this advantage in the final immunity challenge, which she really needed, even though she doesn't end up winning the challenge anyway. But a more interesting element of all of this is the fact that the other 4 end up working together to solve the riddle, and this is where we hear from Marianne that she's actually trying to stop them from getting it, as she wants Lindsay to get the advantage, as she wants to go to the end with Lindsay, which feels like such a massive mistake for Marianne here, to where Lindsay seems pretty clearly to be the biggest jury threat on the board, and for Marianne to want to go against her at the end really just makes her road to a win much harder, and it obviously seeming like more of an emotional move for her due to her not liking how like Jonathan treats the women. And we even hear from her saying, like, Lindsay probably wins if she gets to the end. And the fact that she even considered playing the idol on Lindsay beyond this, and even had to be convinced to vote Lindsay out, is a bit of a knock for me. And then we get to a pretty big pro for Marianne's game, and the fact that she does end up being able to convince Mike to play the idol on her, mind you, after he won immunity. But we do see Mike promise Marianne, Lindsay, and Jonathan all that he's going to play the idol on them. And the fact that he does actually end up playing it for Marianne here, despite no one talking about taking Marianne out, and the fact that Mike's closest ally in Jonathan was the one that was the very clear target, does make it even more impressive that he does end up playing it for Marianne. Though it was interesting to see Marianne not play her own idol in this instance, which for me, I always say that if you have an idol and it is the last time to play it, you should play it even if you're safe anyway. As even if the idol doesn't have a result on the tribal, it does show the jury that you did something in the game. However, I do feel like this situation is a lot more complex, where Mike is obviously playing the idol on her, meaning if she were to play the idol afterwards, it would cause Mike to feel like she duped him, which we've seen many times on this season is not a good place to be in. So that obviously would have burned that bridge for the next round. But also, it feels like her saving this idol for Final Tribal is really what clinches her the win, which is a thing that doesn't normally happen. I mean, we saw this on IOI with Dean, where he reveals his advantages, and it really gained him nothing. But for Marianne here, it was pretty effective. So again, I do think she overall makes the right call in not playing her own idol, despite it going against the common wisdom. Now along the way, we do also see Romeo fake that he has an idol as well, which was funny to see him pretend like he had one at Tribal, and then seeing the jury being excited only for him to reveal it's fake, and then you see the visual disappointment on their faces. But Lindsay does end up being the boot here, and I will give Lindsay credit for not giving up, where she really does fight to guilt trip Mike into playing the idol on her by trying to play up this like father-daughter relationship, though obviously it was all for naught. And Lindsay was a pretty solid player on this season, being capable in all facets of the game, and seemed to be a pretty big jury threat here as well. Though again, from an edit standpoint, I do feel like she ends up being one of the least complex figures in the endgame here, with her having so much of her edit revolve around her rivalry with Jonathan. And again, I did feel confident that she wasn't going to make it to Final Tribal, largely due to her edit. But I do think outside of her disastrous Final 6 round, then obviously playing into Do or Die, I do think she plays a solid game, and despite her seeming to come to this round dead to rights, Marianne still wanted to save her for most of the round. So again, I do think she played a pretty good game here and does come relatively close to winning. And now we're going to jump to the Final 4 round, where we get Samotion once again as the final immunity challenge, which, I mean, has really gotten stale at this point, where we just get the same couple of final immunity challenges over and over and over again, none of them even being endurance. So again, that just ends up being underwhelming here, but surprisingly, we do end up seeing Romeo win his first comp here, and he almost instantly decides to take Marianne to the end, and we do get Mike and Jonathan going into fire, which was pretty much game over to me. Where already the edit had been so much in Marianne's favor by this point, and considering there had been so much set up towards Mike being a losing finalist, with them directly showing him burning jury relationships, I felt like it was obvious that Jonathan was going home here. And really, I find like all Final 4 rounds nowadays just to be kind of boring, where obviously it does come down to the fire making challenge, which can be fun, but the actual lead up to it is typically just seeing people practice fire, which is pretty dull. I mean, this Final 4 round in particular didn't really have much actual strategy going on here, and then the challenge itself was just kind of fine. I mean, Mike makes like a massive fire that's probably bigger than anyone's ever made, but outside of that, not too much going on here. But we do lose Jonathan, who outside of the Tory tribal, which obviously got a bit icky, I did find Jonathan to be a fascinating character across this season, with him starting off with this like golden boy edit, with them really propping up his physical prowess, but that edit just completely goes downhill towards the end of the season, where humorously to me, he starts to get constant negative content episode after episode, and ends up turning what seemed to be a great sense of self-awareness that was propped up early on into a massive weakness for him, where he ends up pissing off most of the women on the cast. But with that said, I don't think he's as bad of a player as the endgame seems to make him be, where, yeah, I think it's pretty clear he probably wasn't winning a jury vote, unless somehow it was a final 2 between Romeo, and even then, there would have been hostile feelings towards him. But I think he does make some pretty solid maneuvers in the game. I mean, like, the Omar boot was his idea. He is the one to piece together that Omar's working all sides, like once he finds out about Lindsay knowing the idol nullifier, and through that is the one to go to Mike to tell Mike to flip Marianne, which we end up seeing on the show. So it's like, that's something that was like edited out that, again, I think you have to give him some credit for. And the fact that also he was pretty well positioned on his original tribe, obviously physical prowess comes into that, but again, he still initially at least seemed to be the central figure there. Then he was also one of the main people to put together the Super Alliance immediately after the merge. So again, I think he does have some things to credit his game with. I think he's overall a solid player, but one that obviously had a very mixed social game, and one that could have definitely managed the jury better. Now moving forward, in the lead up to Final Tribal, we do get a bit of a fun editing change here in us seeing confessionals from the jury members, and we get to hear their thoughts on the Final 3, which they used to have this style of confessionals in older seasons. Though I did like seeing them return here, and we did get a lot more of them here. And it was also nice considering the fact that we didn't get Ponderosa this season, meaning that we were like missing out on what the jury was thinking, so we got to see that here. So that was cool. And then we get to Final Tribal, which was also pretty fascinating, where it did seem like coming into it, it was going to be very close between Mike and Marianne, where the answers actually mattered here. I mean, Romeo obviously didn't really have much of a shot here, but it was interesting to see Mike being berated in a way similar to Coach in South Pacific. Again, this trajectory I was expecting due to his edit, but it did seem like he would have had a massive chance at winning here had he just been willing to own up to his game. But instead, he does end up talking about how he did play with honor and didn't lie to anyone but Roxroy, and obviously ends up getting called out for that. Meanwhile, Marianne has a really impressive Final Tribal performance, being extremely honest about her game and its faults, talking about having played a sloppy game up until the merge, and mentioning the almost mistake of keeping Lindsay around. But she then ends up having this big reveal that she had the idol at Final 5 and kept it a secret, which the jury really props up as being what really convinced them to vote for her. But to me personally, I feel like her great explanation of the Omar boot was more impressive, where she ends up talking about how it betters her position by going person by person and running through all the scenarios, and that ends up being a pretty impressive argument to me. But then she also does a pretty good job at setting up this growth arc of talking about how she used to push people away in her outside life, and this game made her get rid of the fear of rejection. And really, I felt like all this was a great final plea from Marianne, and really was exactly what the jury wanted, for them to have their heartstrings pulled, but also revealing a level of strategy that they were unsure if she had. And we do end up seeing a landslide of votes for Marianne, with her getting every vote but Jonathan's, which to me, again, was a great conclusion to the season, where while I do feel like Marianne was clearly winning coming into it, I do feel like the way the story was presented was in a much more satisfying way here than it was in 41. The Erica winner edit was one that I personally do respect to a degree, that it made it not as clearly obvious that Erica was winning until the very end, though obviously it was lacking certain setup that I do think could have made it stronger. While I feel like the Marianne winner edit here is a lot more balanced and comes off as a lot more satisfying, with the reasons why she won being clearly articulated by the show. And I also feel like it's a satisfying moment to see Marianne win, with this clearly meaning a lot to her, and through that the season goes off in a really positive note here, with the exception of the after show coming afterwards, which was still kind of just I don't love the format, but sadly Jeff has said that's here to stay, so whatever. But again, I do wish that they would give the finalists a bit more time to decompress before doing it, and really just a lot of it just comes off as filler for the show that wasn't particularly interesting. All that, let's start talking about the final three, starting off with Romeo, who's there. I mean, I will say Romeo did surprise me early on, where coming into the season I was expecting him to be an early boot, and for him to end up in the final three here, despite never being in the majority group the entire post-merge, wasn't the trajectory I was expecting, but I did feel like his role as Kingmaker was foreshadowed early on, but he really seemed to lose all steam in the post-merge, both from a game perspective, where he's left out of most of the alliances due to his paranoia, but also from an edit perspective, where he just seemed to be unimportant to many of the votes that happened in the endgame, with the edit not even bothering to show him most of the time. But again, like most of this cast, he does get a decent amount of complexity in the content that he was given, despite the fact that he does have one of the quieter edits here. And through that, I do think he still comes off as a likable figure, though one that I just don't think he played that good of a game. Next up, we do have Mike, who I am largely conflicted on, considering the fact that on paper, I do feel like he had the most amount of control out of any of the people that made it to the end here. But also, I feel like a lot of that control was dictated by emotions. I do feel like he is a very emotional player, and through that, I do think a lot of his control was misguided in how he approached the game. And through his delusions of playing this honorable game, he obviously ends up losing the game, despite being a more active player across the season than Marianne. So obviously his game has a lot of ups and downs, but I do think it was still a strong game. I do think I would have probably personally voted for Mike in this final three. But obviously I understand why he does end up losing here, where he does have a pretty bad final tribal performance and didn't even seem to truly understand his own game during it, which is obviously a massive issue there. Now, as a character, I do think he is one of the better ones of the season. I mean, he was given the most screen time of any player on this season, and I do think overall he has one of the more complex edits on this season, but one that also had a pretty interesting downfall here. It definitely does add to his arc across the season. And finally, let's talk about Marianne, who I think played a solid game. I think she is someone that was obviously outside of the majority group for a lot of the season. It did seem like she was on the bottom of the original Taku tribe, and then coming to the merge, she was outside of that core super alliance, but she still was able to scrape her way all the way to the end despite being on the outside, and was never really targeted the entire time, and obviously ends up making a really strong move in getting rid of Omar at the final 6, and has a really great plea at the end as well. Now again, for my personal criteria on who I would vote for in a game of Survivor, I would probably have not voted for Marianne over Mike, as I do think Marianne had less control across the game, where while she does have a bigger individual move than Mike in the Omar blind side, for me it wouldn't have been enough for me to give her the win, especially considering the fact that she also tried to keep around Lindsay at the very next round, and even the Omar blind side, while she does take full credit for the execution of it, it is also Jonathan and Mike that spur that move into action, even though they end up backing down on it later on. But again, I'm not saying Marianne is a bad winner. I do think she's actually a pretty solid player here. A player that was very good at managing their threat level and was really good at articulating their game. But I think in terms of her winning game, for me, she's kind of teetering between the bottom and middle tiers. I think if you were to ask me right now, I would say she's like at the bottom of the middle tier for me in terms of a winner ranking. Though to be fair, that placement's kind of high considering the fact that, again, she was never truly in a majority alliance the entire season. So despite that fact, I am actually overall pretty impressed with Marianne's game here. Though it's obviously not the type of game that I would respect over games that were in more direct control throughout the entire season. But then as a character, I mean, obviously Marianne is incredible here. I think she's probably one of the best characters to come from recent seasons. And have that character end up winning the season as well is such a rarity that does really prop up the season to me. Again, a season that I am mostly conflicted on, where there definitely are some lulls along the way, but to see Marianne come out on top, the win here does end up elevating the season to me. And there we go. I mean, that is the entire season of Survivor 42. And again, my general thoughts on this season are mostly conflicted. I mean, I do find the cast of this season really strong, on par with 41's, though obviously this season was able to utilize its cast much better through having a much more balanced edit and some better production decisions along the way. But I do still find the overall level of gameplay on this season to just be less interesting. Now, I do think we got a really strong endgame, really from the final 7 on. Obviously, the Jenny boot was really interesting, and even the merge round was fine, but I feel like every other round was just very stable and just not that interesting to me, where I feel like I knew who was going home in the episode from very early on. Which, to be fair, is the approach to editing that they had on this season, which obviously has the pros and cons. The pros that it ends up showing and explaining why things happen, which do boon the storytelling, but also makes the overall story more predictable, and through that, more boring to me at points. Now, I know I'm coming off extremely negative on this season, but to me, this is a pretty standard middle tier season for me. I mean, at the time that 41 finished, I was kind of high on it and debated between like the top and middle tier. Since then, I've probably dropped it down a few spots to where it's probably middle of the middle tier, and to be honest, 41's probably just a spot above it. Those who've honestly, even that placement is not super solid. I'm still pretty conflicted on it. I probably won't even solidify my opinion until the next time I do some sort of season ranking. But 42 is obviously just an improved version of 41 that would just outright be better than 41 if I felt the gameplay was as interesting, which I didn't, which does make it a conflict to me. But I do think 42 had strong moments, had a good cast, and had a really fun endgame, which makes it a solid season overall. But there we go. I mean, those are my thoughts on Survivor 42. Now, moving forward, I'll obviously do the player ranking for this season, which will be the final video in my coverage of Survivor 42. Obviously, I'll be back for Survivor 43, so you can stay tuned for that. The Circle Season 4 just concluded, so you can expect a review of that coming soon. Also, we do have BBAU and the Challenge All-Stars 3 going on. BB24 and the Challenge USA are coming soon. We have Survivor SA also coming. So despite Survivor US not coming back until the end of the year, we still have quite a bit going on over the next few months, so stay tuned for those things. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.